Hey everybody, my name is Dr. Scott Giacomucci. I'm the director of the Phoenix Center for Experiential Trauma Therapy in Media, Pennsylvania, and I'm a trauma therapy practitioner, educator, and researcher. And so today I wanted to create a video to teach the 3 E's of trauma. And so this comes directly from SAMHSA's guidance and understanding of trauma and their publications on trauma-informed care. So if you're someone looking to better understand trauma-informed care, this might be a good video to continue watching. So the 3 E's of trauma. We have the event, the experience, and the effect. The 3 E's. So the first E describes the event of the trauma. So this means this is describing the situation, the circumstance, the event, the thing that happened, or perhaps didn't happen but should have happened, that caused harm, or that was threatening enough to disrupt, to impact somebody. It was usually something that causes physical or psychological harm, or something that threatens to cause physical or psychological harm. So when we talk about trauma, oftentimes we use the term trauma to describe the event, but a better way of thinking about it is that the term trauma is really a Greek word that comes from a word that means wound. So instead of thinking about the trauma as only the event, I think we should think of the trauma as a wound that sometimes is experienced because of an event. And I think SAMHSA's 3 E's, their guidance for understanding trauma, really articulates this well. So not everything that we might consider or judge to be trauma, a traumatic event, causes a traumatic impact or causes someone to have a traumatic reaction to it. So only about 1 in 4 adults that experience something traumatic actually have a traumatic response to that. So 1 out of 4 adults that experience something that most people would consider traumatic event, are going to have a long-term impact from it. Those stats go up a bit more for children, 1 out of 2 children. So fundamentally, there's different ways that adults and children experience adversity or overwhelming experiences based on our developmental levels and where we're at, just kind of in our maturity process. Our brain circuitry and capacity to make sense of the world, to process and understand what's happening, to have control or autonomy or power over what might be happening. And so these are just some of the reasons why trauma can have more of a detrimental impact on children than it might on adults. So the first E is the event. The second E is the experience. This is what we're already getting into here. Second E is the experience. So how was the event experienced? Did the individual experience it as something overwhelming, or did they not? Did the individual have social support or a safe place to go immediately following the experience or the event? Or were they isolated? Were they left on their own to deal with it? What cultural, religious belief systems or values impacted the individual's process of metabolizing the event, making sense of the event, interpreting and making kind of meaning making about what this event means, how it happened, how it relates to me, how I should understand it. So all these different things, one's identity, their age, where they're at in their developmental process, there's a whole bunch of different factors that can influence how one experiences a event that might be described as trauma or traumatic. And again, not everyone that experiences something that is overwhelming, or not everyone that experiences something we would normally call a traumatic event, has a traumatic experience in it. Uh, some people have different perspectives on things, different cultural value systems, different belief systems about death, about the afterlife, about sex, about power, about control, about autonomy, about themselves, about other people. And all these different ways of making sense of the world can impact how we internalize and experience an event, how we experience something that could be experienced as overwhelming by one person and might be something that was difficult for somebody else, but they were able to make sense of it, to process it, to move on from it. So we have the event, we have the way that we experience the event, and the third is the effect that that event and that experience has on us long term. So this focuses on effect or impact. So based on the event that happened and the way somebody experienced that event, they may or may not have a long-term effect. In other words, they may or may not have a traumatic response or start to develop traumatic stress or other trauma-related issues because of the event and the experience that they had. So for some people, the effect of a traumatic experience can manifest immediately following the event. For others, it might not start to surface, or they might not be impacted by it for a couple days, couple hours, couple weeks, couple months. Sometimes folks are in shock or in denial about what happened, and the reality of it might not settle in for a bit, and then they really start to be impacted by it, really starts to affect them. And there's other folks that experience trauma and they go years and years and years, sometimes decades, without being negatively affected by it. And then something happens that pulls out that trauma for them and perhaps triggers it and causes it to begin to affect them in their life now, years and decades later. One of the common ways that this shows up for some of the clients I've worked with is that somebody might experience some sort of childhood adversity or abuse, and they may have been supported through it and found a way to make sense of it and move on from it as a child. And they go through their whole life not being impacted not being significantly impacted by it to the point of it preventing them from functioning in the world until they have their own children and their child becomes the age that they were when they experienced that abuse in the past. And then that really triggers the memories and starts to activate some of the traumatic symptoms that either they experienced initially or didn't ever experience. And it just kind of brings it out of them, seeing their own child at the same age that they were when they were abused. So this is just one common way I notice shows up in my clinical work, that there's kind of a delayed onset of symptoms, a delayed onset of a traumatic effect or reaction. Sometimes there's a cumulative effect where we might experience multiple traumas over our life, and the first couple experiences of trauma, adversity, we might be able to bounce back from, we might be able to make sense of without it impacting our functioning in our life. But as the trauma accumulates or snowballs, it becomes more debilitating. It paralyzes us. The effects become much more pronounced because of how many layers of trauma there are now. And so this is another way that we might experience a delayed effect from past trauma. So sometimes this shows up in kind of triggering flashbacks or nightmares, night terrors. Sometimes this shows up in intrusive thoughts or images. Sometimes it'll show up in the way that we create relationships with others or avoid relationships with others, our attachment styles, Oftentimes, we might reenact abusive relationships or codependent relationships because of past trauma. Sometimes the effects of trauma can include negative impacts to memory or attention or ability to focus. Oftentimes, the hyperarousal that comes with trauma, we're constantly looking over our shoulder. It can look a lot like ADD symptoms and be misdiagnosed. Sometimes it impacts our ability to regulate our emotions, or it impacts our ability to maintain healthy relationships with others, or impacts our fundamental sense of ourself and our identity. These are specifically symptoms of complex PTSD, disruptions in emotional regulation, relationships, and a sense of self. But they're also quite common in classic PTSD as well. So we have the event, we have the experience of the event, and then we have the effect of the event. So these are the 3 E's of trauma. And again, it can be really useful to think of trauma as the wound that comes from the event, the culmination of the event, experience, and effect, rather than only thinking of trauma as the type of event. And so I notice even in this video, as I'm talking about it, I'm using the word interchangeably. I feel like the word trauma has become so ingrained in the way that we talk about adversity, that it's kind of become synonymous with the event, when the etymology of the word suggests that it's really about the effect more so than just the event. So when we're thinking about our own experiences of trauma or vicarious trauma, or we're working with others that have experienced trauma, it can be helpful to conceptualize trauma through the lens of these 3 E's. That there's an event, or the lack of an event in the context of neglect or abandonment. The first E, event. Second is experience. How did the individual, or how did I experience that event? And third is the effects of that event. So how are we impacted by it over time? And I want to also just mention briefly that although trauma is, of course, horrible and tragic and causes a lot of pain and negative impacts to many people who experience adversity, that trauma can also challenge us to grow. There's a whole field of study called post-traumatic growth devoted to understanding how trauma promotes growth, how we might experience positive impacts from adversity and trauma. And I won't go into that too much in this video. If you wanted to learn more about that, you could check out the video on the channel here about post-traumatic growth. But I think it's important in terms of having a holistic view of trauma and its effect, that it can also have a positive effect, that adversity can be fundamentally difficult, and it can impact our ability to function in the world. It can prevent us from achieving our full potential. But adversity, difficulty, trauma can also propel us towards our full potential. It can also challenge us to grow in ways that we didn't think were possible. So in thinking about the 3 E's of trauma, I thought it was important to also consider potential positive effects of trauma. And in the field of post-traumatic growth, we're quick to acknowledge that positive and negative effects from adversity often coexist. That when we experience an event of adversity, and there's the first 2 E's, we have an event that we experience as traumatic. The effect from it could be a mix of positive and negative, a mix of traumatic stress and a mix of post-traumatic growth. So these 2 might seem like opposites, and in some ways they are, but traumatic stress and traumatic growth often go hand in hand, that we can certainly experience aspects of both at the same time. So if you wanted to learn more about trauma, about post-traumatic growth, about trauma-informed care, I encourage you to check out some of the other videos on the channel here. I also have a new book on trauma-informed care that's going to be published in March 2023, so I encourage you to keep an eye out for that. If you wanted to be notified every time a new video gets released on this channel, I encourage you to click the subscribe button below. And I'm really curious, what did you find helpful in this video? What did you learn from this video? And what do you think I may have forgotten to mention in this short video? You could go ahead and put any of your responses to those questions in the comments. And especially if there's any content that you're interested in learning more about and would like to suggest I make a future video about, feel free to put that in the comments below as well. So I hope you find this video helpful in your work or in understanding your own experience of adversity and your own healing process. And thanks for watching.